I never expected my grandfather's death to tear our family apart, but that's exactly what happened when the will was read. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm a 34-year-old lawyer from Portland, Oregon. When Grandpa Joe passed away last spring, he left his 200-acre farm in rural Montana to me, much to the shock and anger of my Uncle Frank. Frank had been managing the farm for the past 15 years, ever since Grandpa Joe's arthritis made it difficult for him to handle the daily operations. Frank lived in the old farmhouse with his wife Margaret and their 2 teenage sons. He'd invested his own money into updating the equipment and improving the irrigation system, believing that his dedication would eventually be rewarded with ownership of the land. The will reading took place in the dusty office of Grandpa Joe's longtime attorney, Harold Brennan, in the small town of Millerville. I remember sitting in that cramped room with its faded law books and the smell of old coffee, watching Frank's face turn red as Mr. Brennan read the words that changed everything. To my granddaughter, Sarah Mitchell, I leave my farm property located at 4425 County Road 78, including all buildings, equipment, and the surrounding 200 acres, in recognition of her commitment to preserving family history and her promise to maintain the land's agricultural heritage. Frank slammed his fist on the desk so hard that Mr. Brennan's coffee cup jumped. "This is ridiculous. I've worked that land for 15 years. Sarah lives in this city and doesn't know the first thing about farming." I sat there in stunned silence. While I was grateful for Grandpa Joe's generosity, I could understand Frank's anger. The farm was worth nearly $2 million, and Frank had every reason to believe it would be his someday. But what none of us knew at the time was that there was more to this story than any of us realized. Chapter 2. Moving to the farm. Despite the family tensions, I decided to honor Grandpa Joe's wishes and move to the farm. I took a leave of absence from my law firm and drove out to Montana with my golden retriever, Max, and enough belongings to last several months. I wanted to understand why Grandpa Joe had chosen me and what he meant about preserving family history. The farmhouse was a sprawling 2-story structure built in the 1920s, with white clapboard siding and a wraparound porch that had seen better days. Frank and his family had moved out the week before, taking only their personal belongings but leaving behind a palpable sense of resentment. Walking through the empty rooms, I could feel the weight of nearly a century of family history. The hardwood floors creaked with stories I'd never heard, and the walls seemed to whisper secrets from generations past. Grandpa Joe had lived in this house his entire life, and his father before him had built it with his own hands. The barn was even more impressive than the house, a massive red structure that dominated the landscape behind the farmhouse. It was the kind of barn you see in paintings of rural America, with soaring rafters and thick wooden beams that had weathered decades of Montana winters. Frank had kept it in excellent condition, and I could see why he felt such a strong connection to the property. But as I explored my inheritance, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. Grandpa Joe had always been a deliberate man who chose his words carefully. His reference to preserving family history seemed to suggest there were stories or documents I needed to find. That first night in the farmhouse, I lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside and wondering what secrets this place might be hiding. Chapter 3. Discovering Family Documents. My first week at the farm was spent getting acquainted with the property and trying to understand the scope of what Grandpa Joe had left me. The house was filled with decades of accumulated belongings, old photographs, farming magazines, receipts, and correspondence that painted a picture of a life dedicated to working the land. In Grandpa Joe's study, I found several boxes of documents that seemed to tell the story of the farm's development over the years. There were receipts for equipment purchases, records of crop yields, correspondence with agricultural extension agents, and detailed maps showing the boundaries of the property. One document that caught my attention was a survey from 1987 that seemed to indicate some confusion about the exact boundaries of the farm. There were handwritten notes in the margins that I couldn't quite decipher, and several areas where the boundaries had been marked and remarked with different colored pens. I also found a collection of letters between Grandpa Joe and various lawyers dating back to the 1980s. The correspondence seemed to involve some kind of legal dispute, but many of the letters were incomplete or referred to documents that I couldn't locate. Frank had called twice that week, ostensibly to check on how I was settling in, but I could tell he was really trying to gauge whether I planned to stay on the farm long term. During our second conversation, he made an offhand comment that stuck with me. "You know, Sarah, your grandfather was always worried about something related to that property. He spent a lot of time in recent years going through old papers and making phone calls to lawyers. I never understood what he was so concerned about." This comment reinforced my growing suspicion that there was more to my inheritance than met the eye. I decided to conduct a more systematic search of the property, starting with the outbuildings that I hadn't yet thoroughly explored. Chapter 4. The Old Barn's Hidden Spaces. The barn became my focus during the second week. It was a magnificent structure, built with the kind of craftsmanship that's rare in modern construction. The main floor housed Frank's farming equipment, while the loft was filled with hay bales and old furniture that had been stored there over the decades. As I explored the barn more carefully, I began to notice details that suggested it held secrets beyond its obvious function. There were spaces between the walls that seemed larger than necessary for insulation, and several areas where the wooden planking appeared to have been removed and replaced at some point. The most intriguing discovery was a small room built into the northeast corner of the barn that wasn't visible from the main floor. I found it by accident when I was examining the loft and noticed that the exterior dimensions of the building didn't match the interior space. Following my lawyer's instincts, I measured the walls carefully and confirmed that there was indeed a hidden room. Finding the entrance to this room took another day of careful investigation. Eventually, I discovered that one section of what appeared to be a solid wall was actually a cleverly concealed door. It was built so seamlessly into the barn structure that you'd never notice it unless you were specifically looking for it. The hidden room was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, and had clearly been designed as a storage space for valuable or sensitive items. The walls were lined with cedar, and there were several built-in shelves and cabinets. Most importantly, the room was completely dry and had been protected from the elements for decades. It was in this hidden room that I found the first clues to the mystery that had been troubling Grandpa Joe. So to Chapter 5. The Document Cache. The hidden room contained a treasure trove of documents that told a story I never could have imagined. There were legal papers, correspondence, photographs, and maps that painted a picture of a decades-long legal controversy surrounding the farm's ownership. The most significant discovery was a metal filing cabinet that contained what appeared to be Grandpa Joe's research into the farm's legal history. He had meticulously organized documents dating back to the 1940s, including several items that I immediately recognized as potentially explosive evidence. Among the papers was a copy of a deed from 1952 that showed the farm being sold to someone named William Hartley, not to my great-grandfather as I had always believed. There were also several letters between Hartley and my great-grandfather discussing some kind of arrangement that wasn't entirely clear from the correspondence I found. Even more intriguing was a folder labeled "A Boundary Disputes" that contained surveys, legal briefs, and correspondence with multiple law firms over a period of nearly 40 years. It became clear that Grandpa Joe had been fighting a quiet legal battle for most of his adult life, trying to resolve questions about the farm's ownership and boundaries. One letter in particular caught my attention. It was from a lawyer in Helena, Montana, dated just 6 months before Grandpa Joe's death. The lawyer was writing to confirm that he had located additional documents that might be relevant to Grandpa Joe's case, and he mentioned that these documents were being stored in the location we discussed. This letter suggested that there were still more documents to be found, and that Grandpa Joe had been actively working on this legal issue right up until his death. But where could these additional documents be located? I spent the rest of that day reading through everything I had found, trying to piece together the puzzle that Grandpa Joe had left for me to solve. Chapter 6: Following the Paper Trail. The documents in the hidden room revealed a complex web of property transactions and legal disputes that went back decades. As I studied the papers more carefully, I began to understand why Grandpa Joe had been so concerned about the farm's legal status. According to the documents I found, the original transaction in the 1940s had been more complicated than a simple sale. William Hartley had apparently purchased the farm from the previous owners, but then immediately entered into some kind of agreement with my great-grandfather that involved shared ownership or management of the property. The problem was that the original agreement between Hartley and my great-grandfather was poorly documented, and over the years, various assumptions had been made about who actually owned what. By the 1980s, these assumptions were being challenged by Hartley's descendants, who claimed that their family still held legal title to portions of the farm. The most disturbing revelation was a letter from 1989 in which a lawyer representing the Hartley family claimed that my great-grandfather had never actually purchased the farm but had only been managing it under an informal agreement that had expired upon Hartley's death in 1967. If this claim was true, it would mean that my family had been living on and farming land that didn't legally belong to us for more than 50 years. No wonder Grandpa Joe had been spending so much time and money on legal research in his final years. But the documents I had found were incomplete. There were references to contracts, deeds, and other papers that weren't in the collection. The letter from the Helena lawyer suggested that some of these missing documents might have been stored elsewhere on the property. I realized that my search was far from over, and that the answer to this mystery might be hidden somewhere else on the farm. Chapter 7: Expanding the Search. Armed with the knowledge from the hidden room, I began a more systematic search of the entire property. The letter from the Helena lawyer had mentioned documents being stored in the location we discussed, which suggested that Grandpa Joe had identified a specific hiding place for the most important papers. I started with the farmhouse, going through every room methodically and looking for any spaces that might conceal additional documents. I checked behind paintings, inside old furniture, and even pulled up loose floorboards in the basement. The house revealed several interesting family artifacts, but nothing that seemed related to the legal dispute. Next, I turned my attention to the other outbuildings on the property. There was a machine shed, a grain silo, a chicken coop that hadn't been used in years, and a small workshop that Grandpa Joe had used for repairs and projects. The workshop proved to be particularly interesting. It was filled with tools, spare parts, and the kinds of odds and ends that accumulate over decades of farm life. But as I explored more carefully, I noticed that Grandpa Joe had been doing more than just mechanical work in this space. There was a small desk in one corner that was covered with papers related to the legal research I had discovered in the barn. These appeared to be more recent documents, copies of things from the hidden room, along with notes in Grandpa Joe's handwriting that showed he had been actively working on the case until shortly before his death. On the desk was a calendar from the previous year with several dates circled in red ink. These dates corresponded to appointments with lawyers, meetings with surveyors, and what appeared to be research trips to various courthouses and archives. One entry in particular caught my attention. Just 3 weeks before Grandpa Joe's death, he had written "Check behind barn door, final documentation" on the calendar. Chapter 8. The Barn Door Discovery. The note about checking behind the barn door sent me back to the structure where I had already made so many discoveries. But this time, I focused specifically on the doors themselves, looking for any hiding places I might have missed. The main barn doors were massive wooden structures that slid on metal tracks. They were heavy and had obviously been built to last, with thick planking and substantial hardware. I had walked through these doors dozens of times over the past 2 weeks, but I had never examined them closely as potential hiding places. Starting with the door on the right side, I began running my hands along the wooden planks, looking for any irregularities or hidden compartments. The wood was weathered and scarred from decades of use, but it all seemed solid and original. The left door proved more interesting. About 6 feet up from the ground, I found a section where the wood felt slightly different under my fingers. When I pressed on it, I could feel a slight give that suggested there might be a hollow space behind the planking. Using a flashlight and examining the area more carefully, I discovered that one section of the door had been modified at some point. There was a rectangular piece of wood that had been fitted so precisely into the door's structure that it was virtually invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. It took me nearly an hour to figure out how to remove this hidden panel. The mechanism was ingenious. You had to press on specific points in a particular sequence, almost like a combination lock made of wood. When I finally got it right, the panel slid aside to reveal a narrow compartment built into the door's interior structure. Inside this compartment was a waterproof metal tube about 18 inches long. My hands were shaking as I pulled it out and carefully opened it. Chapter 9. The Truth Revealed. The metal tube contained documents that completely changed my understanding of the farm's legal situation. These were the final documentation that Grandpa Joe had referenced in his calendar note, the missing pieces of the puzzle that explained everything. The most important document was an original contract dated 1947 between William Hartley and my great-grandfather, Joseph Mitchell Sr. This contract clearly established that Hartley had indeed purchased the farm, but had then immediately sold it to my great-grandfather under terms that included a deferred payment plan. According to the contract, my great-grandfather was to make payments to Hartley over a period of 15 years, after which he would receive clear title to the property. The payments had been made as scheduled, and there was a receipt dated 1962 showing that the final payment had been completed. Even more importantly, there was a quitclaim deed also dated 1962, signed by William Hartley, transferring all interest in the property to Joseph Mitchell Sr. This deed had been properly notarized and recorded with the county clerk giving my great-grandfather clear and undisputed title to the farm. The reason this document was so significant was that it completely contradicted the claims being made by Hartley's descendants. They had apparently been arguing that my great-grandfather had only been a caretaker or manager, not the actual owner. But this quitclaim deed proved beyond any doubt that Hartley had voluntarily transferred ownership to my family in 1962. There were also several other documents in the tube, including correspondence between Grandpa Joe and his lawyers discussing strategy for dealing with the Hartley family's claims. It was clear that Grandpa Joe had been preparing for a potential legal battle, and these documents were his insurance policy. As I sat on the barn floor reading through these papers, I finally understood why Grandpa Joe had been so secretive about his legal research and why he had chosen me to inherit the farm. Chapter 10. Understanding Grandpa Joe's strategy. The documents revealed that Grandpa Joe had been much more strategic about the inheritance than any of us had realized. He hadn't just randomly chosen to leave the farm to me instead of Frank. He had made a calculated decision based on the legal challenges he knew were coming. In a letter to his lawyer dated just 2 months before his death, Grandpa Joe explained his reasoning. He wrote that he believed the Hartley family would eventually file a formal legal challenge to the farm's ownership, and he wanted to ensure that the property would be defended by someone with legal training and resources. Frank, despite his dedication to the farm, didn't have the background or financial means to fight a prolonged legal battle. Grandpa Joe was also concerned that Frank's emotional attachment to the property might lead him to make compromises that weren't in the family's best interests. By leaving the farm to me, Grandpa Joe was ensuring that any legal challenge would be met by someone who understood how the legal system worked and who had the professional connections to mount an effective defense. He had hidden the most important documents because he suspected that the Hartley family might try to challenge the will or search the property for evidence. The letter also revealed that Grandpa Joe had been in contact with descendants of William Hartley for several years, trying to negotiate a settlement of their claims. But the negotiations had broken down when the Hartley family demanded a significant portion of the farm's current value, despite having no legal basis for their claims. Grandpa Joe's final strategy was to ensure that the definitive proof of ownership would be preserved and that it would be in the hands of someone who could use it effectively. He had turned the inheritance into a legal trap, waiting for the Hartley family to make their move so that their claims could be definitively rejected. Reading this letter, I felt a mixture of admiration for Grandpa Joe's foresight and sadness that he had carried this burden alone for so many years. Chapter 11. The Hartley Family's Challenge. Just 3 weeks after I discovered the documents behind the barn door, I received a certified letter that proved Grandpa Joe's predictions had been accurate. The letter was from a law firm in Helena representing the estate of William Hartley Jr., the son of the original William Hartley. The letter claimed that my family had been illegally occupying land that belonged to the Hartley estate, and it demanded that I either purchase the property from them at current market value or vacate within 90 days. They cited various documents and legal precedents, and they clearly believed they had a strong case. Under normal circumstances, this kind of challenge might have been devastating. The legal costs alone could have been enormous, and the uncertainty could have dragged on for years. But thanks to Grandpa Joe's careful preparation, I was ready for this fight. I immediately contacted the law firm that had been representing Grandpa Joe in his research, and within a week, we had prepared a comprehensive response that included copies of all the key documents from behind the barn door. The quitclaim deed from 1962 was particularly powerful evidence since it showed that William Hartley Sr. had voluntarily and legally transferred all interest in the property to my great-grandfather. The response also included a detailed timeline showing all payments made by my great-grandfather to Hartley, along with receipts and bank records that Grandpa Joe had meticulously preserved. This evidence made it clear that the original transaction had been completed exactly as agreed, with no outstanding obligations or claims. Perhaps most importantly, we were able to show that the Hartley family's current claims were based on incomplete information. They had apparently found some of the original correspondence between Hartley and my great-grandfather, but they had never seen the final contract or the quitclaim deed that resolved all outstanding issues. Within 30 days of receiving the challenge, we had not only refuted their claims but had also put them on notice that any continued harassment could result in a countersuit for defamation and interference with property rights. Chapter 12. Resolution and New Beginnings. The Hartley family's legal challenge collapsed quickly once they were presented with the evidence that Grandpa Joe had so carefully preserved. Their lawyers advised them that they had no legal basis for their claims, and within 60 days of their initial letter, they formally withdrew all challenges to my ownership of the farm. But the resolution of the legal dispute was only the beginning of my understanding of what Grandpa Joe had really left me. As I continued to explore the property and read through his documents, I realized that he had been trying to preserve not just the legal ownership of the farm, but also its history and the story of our family's connection to the land. The documents I found revealed a rich history of agricultural innovation, community involvement, and family dedication that spanned nearly a century. My great-grandfather and grandfather had been pioneers in sustainable farming practices, and they had maintained detailed records of their experiments with crop rotation, soil conservation, and water management. Frank, despite his initial anger about the inheritance, eventually came to understand and appreciate what Grandpa Joe had been trying to accomplish. When I explained the legal situation and showed him the documents, he realized that Grandpa Joe had been protecting not just my inheritance, but the legacy that Frank himself had helped to build. We worked out an arrangement that allowed Frank to continue managing the day-to-day operations of the farm while I handled the business and legal aspects. This partnership has proven beneficial for both of us, and it has allowed the farm to continue operating as Grandpa Joe intended. Looking back on this experience, I'm amazed by the foresight and wisdom that Grandpa Joe demonstrated in his final years. He understood that preserving the farm would require both legal expertise and practical farming knowledge, and he found a way to ensure that both would be available when they were needed. The letter behind the barn door was more than just evidence. It was Grandpa Joe's final gift to his family, ensuring that the land he loved would remain in the hands of people who would appreciate and protect it for future generations. Thank you for listening to this story about family, legacy, and the importance of preserving our history. I'd love to hear from listeners around the world. Please write in the comments and tell us where you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one.